He came in wearing the kind of smile people borrow when they think the room already belongs to them. Termination papers in hand, confidence polished to a shine. She didn't even stand. She just glanced at the folder, then at the clock, as if his authority had already expired. By 8:12 a.m., the executive floor already smelled like expensive coffee, printer heat, and panic disguised as routine. That particular kind of panic never announced itself. It lived in little things, in assistants walking faster than usual without running, in doors closing softly instead of fully, in the way people smiled with only their mouths, as if showing too many teeth might count as a confession. Elena noticed all of it the second the elevator doors opened, the glass walls, the polished black stone, the city spread below in cold silver light, every building looking sharp enough to cut. On any other morning, the view might have felt impressive. Today, it looked like a witness. She stepped out wearing a slate gray suit that didn't ask for attention but carried it anyway. Clean lines, no drama, no wasted movement. Her tablet under one arm, phone silent, expression unreadable. She moved through the corridor like someone who had already made peace with the outcome, whatever it was. That unsettled people more than anger ever could. Two analysts near the conference suite stopped whispering when they saw her. One looked down at his screen so fast it was almost theatrical. The other gave her a stiff nod, the corporate equivalent of crossing yourself before a storm. Interesting, she thought. No one avoided your eyes that hard unless a meeting had been scheduled around your name. She kept walking. At the far end of the hall, the boardroom doors stood open. Inside, the long walnut table gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. Screens were awake. Water glasses were aligned with mathematical precision. Three legal folders sat near the center seats like small sealed verdicts. And near the windows, with one hand casually in his pocket and the other holding a thin black document case, stood Martin Kessler. He turned when he heard her heels. There it was, that smirk. Not a grin, not amusement, something thinner, more polished, the kind of expression men wore when they mistook temporary leverage for destiny. "Elena," he said, as if greeting someone late to their own ambush. "Right on time?" She stopped just inside the doorway and set her tablet on the table with controlled ease. "You sound surprised." "Should I be?" "You called me to a meeting before 9, she said. "Around here, that usually means one of three things: litigation, layoffs, or somebody suddenly pretending ethics matter." For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes, small, quick, gone. He gave a short laugh. "Still sharp?" "Still employed," she replied. That landed, barely, but enough. Behind him, the skyline flashed across the glass in pale morning light. The CFO's assistant passed outside the room, saw the two of them, and instantly kept walking without breathing. Elena almost admired the discipline. Martin laid the black case on the table and clicked it open with slow precision. Inside was a termination packet. Crisp paper, signature tabs, HR watermark. Finality, professionally formatted. He rotated it toward her. "I'm here to sign your termination," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Men like Martin believed quiet cruelty sounded more official. For one suspended second, the room seemed to narrow. Even the air conditioning felt louder, cold air brushing the back of Elena's neck like a warning. She looked down at the papers, then at him, then almost lazily at the digital wall clock. 8:14. When she looked back, her expression had not changed. Martin mistook that for shock. People like him always did. They couldn't imagine composure unless they were the ones performing it. "I know," he continued, leaning one hand against the table. "This may feel abrupt, but authority shifted last night. The board wants cleaner execution, tighter approvals, less improvisation. Improvisation. Interesting word to use for the woman who had kept the company's largest acquisition from collapsing twice in 6 months. Elena rested two fingers on the edge of the packet without opening it. And yet, she said softly, you brought this to me before the 9 o'clock review. His jaw moved once. Yes. Before the CFO signs off? A pause. Operationally, that's no longer required. There it was. Not the lie itself. Those were ordinary. The speed of it. Too smooth, too ready, like a bridge built in the dark before anyone asked where it led. Outside the boardroom, footsteps slowed. Someone was listening. Someone always was when power changed hands. Elena slid the termination packet back toward him. Martin frowned. You're not going to read it? I don't need to read choreography to know who rehearsed it. His smile hardened. Be careful. She gave him a look almost kind enough to be insulting. Martin, when men say, be careful in rooms like this, they usually mean they've confused access with ownership. Silence, a heavy, velvet kind of silence, the sort that settles over a room before something expensive breaks. He straightened. You no longer have signing authority. That made her smile. Not broadly, not dramatically, just enough to alter the atmosphere. It was the kind of smile that didn't arrive alone. It brought memory with it, timing, paper trails, the sound of locks clicking open somewhere far behind the walls. I'm here to close the deal, she said. Martin blinked once, a tiny reaction, but real. Then he laughed, too quickly this time. What deal? Elena picked up her phone, turned it face down on the table, and smoothed an invisible crease from her sleeve. The one you were never supposed to touch. Now he was very still. No more smirk. No more polished contempt. Just a man standing in a boardroom at 8:15 a.m. holding termination papers that had suddenly lost their clean shape. From somewhere down the corridor came the low ding of an elevator opening, then footsteps, measured, multiple, approaching. Martin looked toward the door. Elena didn't. That was what changed the room. Not the footsteps, not the silence, not even the packet between them. It was the fact that only one of them seemed to know who was about to walk in. And when the boardroom handle moved, Martin finally understood that the meeting he had prepared for might not be the one he was about to have. The door opened without ceremony, but the effect was surgical. First came Dana Rowe from legal, carrying a red-lined binder thick enough to bruise a career. Behind her walked CFO Adrian Vale, expression cool, immaculate, and far too awake for 8:16 in the morning. Two more people followed, one from compliance, one from investor relations, both wearing the careful neutrality of people who already sensed they had entered the wrong version of the story. Martin stepped back from the table as if posture alone could recover control. Adrian, he said, forcing an easy smile into place. Good, we were just finalizing a personnel transition. Elena didn't move. The CFO's eyes went first to the termination packet, then to Martin's hand resting beside it, then to Elena. It took him less than a second to read the geometry of the room. Power has a posture. Panic does too. He seemed to recognize both. Were you? Adrian asked. Martin gave a short nod. Authority shifted last night. We're streamlining approval channels before the 9 o'clock review. That sentence sounded practiced, clean, preloaded, the kind of line a person repeats to himself in the elevator so it will sound like truth when it reaches the boardroom. Dana from legal set the binder on the walnut table. The sound was flat, heavy, final. No, she said calmly. We're not. Martin turned to her. Excuse me? She opened the binder, flipped 3 color-tabbed sections with the ease of someone who had been awake long before dawn, and laid a page in front of Adrian. Section 4.2, Delegated Transaction Authority, she said. Read with the emergency addendum executed at 6:03 a.m. There was the slightest movement in Martin's face, barely visible. A crack, not a collapse. Elena watched it happen the way one watches ice split under weight, quietly, with no need to interfere. Adrian read in silence. His eyes moved once down the page, then back to the signature block. "Who executed this?" he asked. "Elena Morozova," Dana replied, "countersigned by the External Financing Desk and acknowledged by Restructuring Council." Martin gave an incredulous laugh. "That's impossible." Elena finally looked at him. "No," she said softly. "Inconvenient." He ignored her, or tried to. This deal was under internal review. She had no independent clearance to move it. Dana slid a second document across the table. She did after midnight. A pause. The city beyond the glass looked bleached by morning light. Traffic below moved in distant silver lines, indifferent and relentless. Inside the room, nobody breathed quite normally anymore. Martin's voice sharpened. "After midnight?" Adrian looked up. "Why was I not briefed before this morning?" No one answered immediately, and that silence said too much. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of professionals deciding very carefully how much incompetence they were willing to describe before coffee. Elena reached for her tablet, tapped once, and rotated the screen toward Adrian. A contract appeared, not a draft, not a proposal. Executed, time-stamped, multi-party authorization chain complete. At the top right corner, in discreet but devastating clarity, sat the figure, $90 million. The number changed the temperature of the room. Investor relations leaned in. Compliance stopped pretending to be decorative. Martin's smirk vanished so completely it was hard to remember it had existed an hour ago. Adrian's jaw tightened. "This was approved?" "It was preserved," Elena corrected. He looked at her, and for the first time that morning, she let the steel show. "The buyers were ready to walk at midnight," she said, "not because the deal was weak, because someone inside this building froze the authority chain and triggered a false internal conflict marker. They were told we were unstable, divided, and unable to execute before market open." Martin cut in fast. "That's a serious accusation." She turned to him with almost graceful calm. "No, a serious accusation would require uncertainty." Dana closed the binder halfway, not to end the discussion, but to narrow it. "We trace the approval interruption," she said. "It originated from a restricted admin reroute request attached to Martin's office at 11:42 p.m. Martin stared at her. "You can't prove intent from a routing request." "Correct," Dana said, "but we can prove interference." That landed harder. Adrian stood very still, one hand on the back of a chair, as though the room had shifted half an inch beneath him, and he was deciding whether to blame the architecture or the people inside it. "Elena," he said, "walk me through exactly what happened." She nodded once. At 11:31 p.m., the Buyers' Council sent notice that they would suspend execution if final approval authority remained in dispute. At 11:42, someone flagged my credentials as pending administrative limitation. At 11:47, Martin's office requested transition documents from HR. At 12:05, the buyer's side asked for written proof that the person handling final sign-off still had authority to close. Her voice stayed measured, but the words had edge, not theatrical edge, precision edge, glass, not fire. "I gave them proof," Martin scoffed. "By going around internal command? By going around sabotage." The silence this time was different, less velvet, more wire. Adrian's gaze shifted to the termination packet still lying open on the table like a prop from a play that had forgotten its audience. "You came in here," he said to Martin, "with HR paperwork." Martin lifted a hand. "Because I had reason to believe her authority was suspended." "Based on what?" Martin opened his mouth, closed it, a tiny, fatal hesitation. Outside, someone passed the conference room carrying coffee. The scent drifted through the gap in the door, absurdly normal, as if the building itself refused to acknowledge how close one man was to professional freefall. Adrian looked back at the contract on Elena's tablet, then at Dana's addendum, then at the timestamp. 6:03 a.m., 6 minutes. Just 6 minutes between one version of the company and another. Elena saw him doing the math, saw the exact moment he understood that while Martin was polishing a termination script, she had been awake, in motion, preserving a $90 million deal before sunrise. That was the part men like Martin never prepared for. Not intelligence, not resistance, competence under pressure, because arrogance knows how to dominate a room. It has no idea what to do with someone who already saved it. Adrian exhaled slowly. "And the final authority?" Dana answered before anyone else could. "She holds it." The words did not arrive loudly. They didn't need to. They struck the center of the table and seemed to stay there, visible, like a blade left standing on its tip. Martin actually laughed then, but there was no polish left in it. "This is insane. We're letting one person override executive transition protocol over a deal that hasn't even—" "It has," Elena said. She tapped the screen again. A second page opened, signed acknowledgement, counterparty seal, funding release trigger, board notice queued, completed. Investor relations went pale first. Compliance muttered, almost involuntarily, "Oh." It was such a small sound, and yet in rooms like this, tiny sounds often carried the truth better than speeches. Adrian looked at Martin for a long moment that contained no warmth at all. "Did you know," he asked evenly, "that the transaction was already at execution threshold when you initiated termination papers?" Martin said nothing, which in corporate language is sometimes louder than a confession. Elena picked up the black packet he had brought her and turned it between her fingers, studying the tabs, the neat signatures, the smug efficiency of it. Then she set it down in front of Adrian. "He came to end the wrong contract," she said. No one smiled. That was the remarkable part. The line could have earned it. In another room, with weaker stakes, it might have broken the tension. Not here. Here it only made the truth sharper, because the room wasn't interested in wit anymore. It was interested in sequence, timing, liability. Who moved first? Who overreached? Who would be left holding the paper when the board started asking names instead of questions? And when Martin finally looked at Elena again, really looked at her, he seemed to understand something he should have understood much earlier. She had not stayed calm because she was cornered. She had stayed calm because she knew exactly when the corner would move. Adrian straightened and closed the binder with two deliberate fingers. "We are not discussing termination," he said. "We are discussing unauthorized interference with a protected approval chain tied to a $90 million contract." Then he turned to Elena. "Stay." One word, simple, controlled, yet it changed everything, because Martin heard the second word hidden inside it, not stay, yours. And judging by the way Dana reached for a separate folder marked board notice, the next 6 minutes were about to become the longest of his career. If you've ever watched someone walk into a room so sure they owned your future, only to realize they never understood your worth, this story is for you. Subscribe because the next move changes everything. And tell me in the comments, At what exact moment did Martin realize he had targeted the wrong woman? The room did not explode. That was the unsettling part. No shouting, no dramatic accusations hurled across polished walnut. No one slammed a fist onto the table and demanded answers in the theatrical style junior executives secretly imagined power worked. Real power rarely performed like that. Real power got quieter. Adrian didn't raise his voice when he told Martin to step away from the packet. Dana didn't look angry when she collected the HR paperwork and slipped it into the red-lined binder as if she were preserving evidence from a minor fire that had not yet reached oxygen. Even compliance, who usually moved with the emotional urgency of office furniture, straightened by a fraction. And somehow that was worse, because noise leaves room for denial. Silence leaves fingerprints. Martin tried one last version of confidence anyway. Men like him always did. Even when the floor gave way, they still smoothed their cufflinks on the way down. "This is getting distorted," he said, jaw tight, smile almost reconstructed. "We had a legitimate internal concern about approval exposure. I acted to contain risk." Elena leaned back slightly in her chair, one hand resting beside her tablet. Contain risk. Such elegant wording for a man who had walked in carrying termination papers like a bouquet. Adrian looked at him with the expression of someone examining a hairline fracture in expensive glass. "You initiated personnel action against the executive who preserved the deal." Martin didn't answer fast enough. That tiny delay moved through the room like cold air under a door. He pivoted instead. "The deal wasn't preserved by one person. We have teams for a reason." Elena gave the faintest tilt of her head. "And yet only one person was scheduled to be removed before market open." Again, silence. Investor relations shifted first, flipping through a printed summary with hands now slightly less steady than before. She kept glancing between the execution threshold and the timestamps, as if hoping numbers might rearrange themselves out of pity. They didn't. The contract sat on Elena's tablet like a quiet accusation. $90 million, approved, locked, timed so precisely it felt less like paperwork and more like a blade slid between two ribs without disturbing the tie. Dana opened the separate folder marked Board Notice. That made Martin finally lose a shade of color. "Hold on," he said. "This does not go to the board before internal review." Dana looked up. "It already qualifies for board visibility." Under whose interpretation? Under the signed governance framework you approved in February. That hit with exquisite cruelty, not because it was loud, because it was administrative. There are few humiliations more complete than being cornered by your own procedures. Martin's eyes flicked toward Adrian, searching for softness, an opening, an ally, a pause, any small bridge that might carry him from exposure back into ambiguity. He found none. Adrian stepped toward the window, then turned back. The skyline reflected faintly in the hard plane of the glass behind him. "We have 9 minutes before the board review begins. I want sequence, liability, and current execution status. Now." No one moved for a second. Then the room reorganized itself around Elena. That was the moment. Not when Dana said she holds it. Not when the contract appeared. Not even when the termination packet became evidence. It was now, when people stopped looking at Martin for direction and started looking at Elena for timing. A small thing from the outside, devastating from the inside. She stood, not abruptly, not like someone rushing to defend herself. She rose with that same unnerving calm she'd carried all morning, smoothing one hand over the front of her jacket as if the room were merely late to a meeting she'd been leading for hours. "The buyer's counsel is on standby for final verbal alignment," she said. Funding release trigger is active. Treasury lock expires at 8:31. If we miss that, we don't lose the contract, but we lose the pricing corridor. Investor relations looked up sharply. How much corridor? Elena's gaze didn't leave Adrian. 8 figures. A pulse moved through the room. There it was, that soft corporate terror, the kind that never screams but immediately recalculates blame. Adrian's expression hardened by a degree. Can the window still be preserved? Yes, Elena said, if no one interrupts me again. No one even pretended not to understand the target of that sentence. Martin exhaled through his nose, the sound thin and dangerous. You're enjoying this. Elena turned to him then, and for the first time that morning, there was no softness at all in her face. Only precision, only frost. No, she said. If I were enjoying it, I would have let you finish. That landed so cleanly the room seemed to recoil from it. Compliance actually stopped writing. Dana's mouth almost moved. Almost, but she was too disciplined to let satisfaction become visible in billable daylight. Adrian checked his watch. Do it. 2 words, permission, recognition, transfer. Elena picked up her phone and entered a secure code. The screen reflected briefly in the polished surface of the table, a shimmer of white and blue and controlled velocity. She connected the call to the room speakers. One ring, then another. Then a voice, smooth and London calm, filled the boardroom. Elena, are we clear? Martin closed his eyes for half a second. That told her everything. He knew the voice. He had known this was real. He had just gambled that she would be removed before reality arrived. Yes, Elena said, we are now. A pause on the line, a faint shuffle of paper, then, good, we were advised there had been instability on your side. Elena let the sentence sit in the room before answering, a surgeon's pause, deliberate, exact. That concern was internal, she said. It has been resolved. Martin looked at Adrian. You can't let her say that. Adrian didn't even turn. Be quiet. The words were flat, controlled, merciless in their lack of volume. The voice on the speaker continued, Then let's finalize authority confirmation for the record. Elena placed her fingertips lightly against the table edge. Confirmed, Elena Morozova, delegated signatory under Addendum 4.2, Emergency Execution Authority, acknowledged at 6:03 a.m., Treasury coordination active, legal continuity preserved. The response came instantly, confirmed on our side. Those 4 words changed the room more completely than any speech could have. Because unlike outrage, unlike suspicion, unlike internal politics, confirmation had nowhere to hide. It was clean, public, usable, the kind of sentence that appears later in transcripts and ruins the careers of people who thought verbal ambiguity was a strategy. Investor relations lowered her pen. Compliance slowly looked at Martin. Dana simply closed the board notice folder and moved it 1 inch closer to Adrian. That inch felt enormous. Elena, said the voice on the call, we are prepared to release once the CFO acknowledges. She turned to Adrian. He met her gaze. For a fleeting second, something passed between them. Not warmth, not quite trust, but the cold professional understanding that one person in the room had spent the morning protecting the company while another had been trying to rearrange it around his ego. Adrian stepped forward. This is Adrian Vale, he said to the speaker. CFO, I acknowledge active authority and continuity of execution. A beat, then received, releasing now. There was no drum roll, no cinematic swell, only the tiny electronic sound from Elena's tablet as the confirmation updated. Funding release. Trigger completed. It should have looked ordinary. Instead, it looked like judgment. Martin stared at the screen as if numbers themselves had betrayed him. In a way, they had. Because numbers never cared for titles. They only recorded who delivered and who interfered, who protected value and who mistook proximity to power for ownership of it. And in that merciless arithmetic, Elena had just become impossible to erase. The call ended, the speakers went silent. The city beyond the windows continued to glitter in the morning light, cold and indifferent. Somewhere outside the boardroom, a phone rang. Someone laughed too loudly at nothing. Somewhere, an assistant was probably still carrying coffee, unaware that on the other side of one glass wall, a career had just slipped several inches off its axis. Adrian looked at the tablet, then at Martin, then at the termination packet lying abandoned between them like a snakeskin no one wanted to admit they had touched. Finally, he spoke. "At 8:14, he said, voice even, "you entered this room to terminate the only person authorized to close a live $90 million transaction." No one moved. Martin tried to answer, but what came first was not language. It was breath, sharp, uneven, human at last. Elena watched him with a calm that now felt almost cruel in its elegance, because the room had changed again. Earlier, Martin had come in smiling, certain he was about to reduce her to paperwork. Now he stood in the same spot with the same polished shoes, the same expensive watch, the same cultivated posture, and looked like a man who had just realized the contract that mattered most this morning was never hers. It was his. At 8:29, the boardroom stopped feeling like a room. It became a ledger, not of money, though there was plenty of that on the table now, not of titles. Those were already beginning to lose their shine. No, this was something colder, more exact, a ledger of sequence. Who knew? Who acted? Who interfered? Who delivered? And in companies like this, sequence was often more dangerous than intent. Intent could be explained, reframed, buried under strategic language and 3 layers of legal caution. But sequence? Sequence was architecture. It told you who opened the door, who moved the chair, who touched the wire, who cut the line. It told you where the truth had walked before the story got dressed. Dana stood near the head of the table, organizing papers into clean parallel stacks. She handled documents the way surgeons handled instruments, without drama, without waste, with a respect that looked suspiciously like menace. Adrian remained by the window for one last second, hands in his pockets, jaw tight enough to signal thought but not panic. Martin was still standing where confidence had abandoned him. He had not sat down once. That, Elena noticed, was beginning to matter. People sat when they belonged in the meeting. They stood when they thought motion might still save them, when they thought posture could delay consequence, when they were not yet ready to understand that the room had already decided what role they were playing. Outside, through the glass, the executive corridor had become unnaturally quiet. Assistants passed more carefully. A pair of junior directors slowed near the door, sensed the temperature on the other side, and kept moving without looking in. Corporate buildings had their own weather systems, and this floor was in the eye of something elegant and brutal. Adrian finally turned. "The board joins in 1 minute," he said. "No speeches, no improvisation. I want factual chronology only." Martin recovered just enough to say, "Then I'd like the record to reflect that my actions were taken under a legitimate concern regarding governance exposure." Dana didn't even look at him. "It will reflect that you initiated personnel documents against an active signatory during a live execution window." His mouth tightened. "That's your phrasing." "No," she said, aligning the corners of a binder with almost insulting calm. "That's the timestamp." Elena lowered her gaze for a moment, hiding the faint shift in her expression. That was the thing about good legal people. They didn't need theatrics. They knew facts were heavier than rage. You didn't need to shout when chronology was on your side. The screen at the end of the room flickered to life. Board review connection, secure line active, participants joining. One by one, names appeared in small, illuminated rectangles across the display. Chairwoman, audit committee lead, two independent directors, outside governance council. Faces followed, crisp lighting, neutral backgrounds, controlled expressions, the kind of faces that had spent decades learning how not to react in real time. But Elena had been in enough of these meetings to know the tells. One director glanced down too quickly, already reviewing the pre-read. Another leaned back too early, skeptical by instinct. The chairwoman, Miriam Hart, said nothing at all when her window connected. That was usually the dangerous one. "Good morning," Adrian began. No decorative tone, no executive warmth. "We are proceeding with an amended priority agenda related to a completed $90 million transaction and a governance incident tied to its execution window." That got their attention. Not loudly, never loudly, but you could feel the line tighten across the call, like invisible wire pulled taut between cities. Miriam folded her hands. "Define incident." Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked toward Dana. Smart. "Let legal place the first stone." Dana opened the red-lined binder. At approximately 8:14 a.m., a termination packet was presented to Elena Morozova, who at that time held active delegated authority under Emergency Addendum 4.2 to complete the transaction now reflected as executed. A pause followed, not confusion, impact. One of the independent directors took off his glasses. Another muttered something off mic and went still. Governance Council lifted his head with the weary alertness of someone who had just recognized the shape of a future memorandum. Miriam's voice remained perfectly level. "Was the transaction in fact executed?" Elena answered this time. "Yes." Every face on the screen turned to her. It was almost physical, that shift, like spotlights clicking on one after another, but colder, more surgical. She felt the weight of attention and did not move away from it. Her tablet lay before her, confirmation still visible, its clean interface almost absurd in its simplicity. So much destruction contained in such tidy design. Miriam continued. "State your role for the record." Elena Morozova, Senior Strategy Director, Emergency Delegated Signatory as of 6:03 a.m., legal continuity preserved, Treasury trigger completed, counterparty acknowledgement received. No embellishment, no triumph, just steel wrapped in syntax. Martin stepped in before the silence could settle in her favor. "For context," he said, "authority structure was under review last night, and there was internal confusion about whether her delegated status remained valid by morning." Elena did not turn toward him. Neither did Miriam. That told him more than a rebuttal would have. Dana looked down at the page in front of her. There was no valid confusion in the documents. There was interference in the process. Martin's voice sharpened. "That is not established." "It is traceable," Dana replied. Again, that unbearable precision, not accusation, traceability. The board understood the difference immediately. In corporate life, accusation invited debate. Traceability invited discovery. Audit trails, logs, email retention, server events, the slow, elegant violence of records that did not get tired and did not forget. Adrian stepped toward the table. The practical issue is this. While Elena was preserving a closing window tied to a live $90 million contract, personnel action was initiated against her in parallel. One of the directors spoke for the first time. By whom? No one answered at once, because sometimes a name changes a room more completely than a number. Martin did what ambitious men often do when the staircase collapses beneath them. He tried to become procedural. "This is being framed unfairly," he said. "I acted based on risk indicators presented to me. If there was an error, it was structural, not personal." Elena finally looked at him. There it was again, that almost unbearable calm. The calm that did not plead, did not defend, did not chase approval, only waited for false language to finish building its own coffin. "Structural?" she repeated softly. "That's an elegant word for carrying termination papers into a live execution meeting?" He turned to her. "You're making this theatrical." "No," she said. "You did that when you rehearsed the ending before checking who held authority." The words landed with the quiet precision of a blade set on glass. For the first time since the call began, Miriam's expression changed. Barely. One brow moved. A minor shift, but meaningful. Not because Elena had scored a point, because the sentence clarified motive without needing to argue it. Martin saw it too, and panicked. Only a little. Only in the eyes. But for men like him, that was practically a confession. "I reject the implication," he said, and now there was strain in the polish. "The company cannot function if emergency authority is used as a personal shield against accountability." Elena leaned forward, hands lightly touching the edge of the table. "No," she said, voice low and clean, "but it can survive when emergency authority is used to save $90 million before sunrise." Silence. Not empty silence. Recognition. You could almost hear the board recalculating the entire morning in reverse. The deal, the timing, the attempted removal, the visibility risk, the governance exposure, the grotesque optics of firing the person who had just preserved value while the approval chain was still warm. Adrian glanced at the clock. 8:34. Then at Dana, then at the board. And Elena understood all at once that the next phase would not be about whether Martin had overreached. That question was already dead. The real question now was how publicly the company intended to admit it. Miriam folded her hands tighter. "I want the packet, the access chronology, the reroute request, and the execution chain circulated to directors before noon." Dana nodded. "Already in preparation." Martin went very still. That sentence had a particular sound in rooms like this. It sounded administrative, harmless almost. It was not. It meant the matter had crossed a line from internal tension to board material, from office maneuvering to documented governance event, from whispers in hallways to folders with names on them. And once that happened, careers no longer ended dramatically, they ended neatly. Elena sat back as the screen light reflected in the glass walls around them. The city beyond remained silver and indifferent, as if towers had not just watched one man mistake proximity to power for possession of it. Martin's eyes found hers one last time. No smirk, no superiority, no polished contempt, only the brittle stare of someone beginning to understand that the most dangerous moment was not when she saved the deal. It was when the board started reading, and when Miriam said, "We will continue this in closed sequence," even Adrian's face changed by half a degree, because everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. Just not yet for whom. Closed sequence sounded harmless, like a scheduling adjustment, a procedural turn, a smaller room, a narrower agenda, a cleaner set of notes. In reality, it was the corporate equivalent of a blade being placed on velvet. No one spoke for a moment after Miriam said it. The board windows remained open on the screen, each face composed, each silence now carrying more intent than conversation ever could. The morning light had shifted outside the glass, turning the skyline from silver to white, bleaching the city into something sharp and merciless. Down below, traffic continued in orderly ribbons, as if nothing on the 32nd floor had just tilted off its axis. Inside the boardroom, however, the air had changed. Martin felt it first. You could tell by the way his shoulders tightened without moving, by the way one hand hovered near the back of a chair but never claimed it, by the tiny mechanical reset of his jaw, as if he were still trying to grind this into a version of reality he could survive. He looked at Adrian, then at Dana, then at the board screen. No one rescued him. That was the first verdict. Mr. Kessler, Miriam said at last, her voice calm enough to chill glass, step out of the room. Not please, not for a moment, not even while we review. Just 4 words. Flat, controlled, irreversible. Martin stared at the screen. With respect, I should remain for any discussion involving my actions. Dana closed the binder. The sound was small, but it snapped through the room with almost indecent precision. With respect, she said, that is exactly why you should not. The irony of it hung there for 1 second too long. He exhaled through his nose, looked briefly toward Elena, and in that glance there was a final, ugly flicker of the old instinct, contempt reaching for one last foothold before embarrassment dragged it under. She met it without expression, not cold, not warm, worse, finished. Martin straightened his tie because men like him always reached for costume when character failed. Then he took the black termination packet from the table as if retrieving it might somehow restore ownership of the narrative. Leave it, Adrian said. Martin's hand stopped. Another pause, another invisible line crossed. He let the packet go. It stayed there on the table between the water glasses and the board papers, neat, expensive, professionally tabbed, and now so stripped of power it looked almost pathetic. A trap with no spring left in it. A script no one wanted to perform. Martin turned and walked to the door. No dramatic exit, no slammed handle, no final threat hurled over the shoulder. Just the quiet, unnatural walk of someone trying not to look like he had been removed. When the door shut behind him, the room exhaled. Not loudly, but together. Miriam waited exactly 1 beat before speaking again. Now, she said, we continue. Elena remained standing for a moment, then sat only when Adrian did. It was a small choice, almost invisible, but in rooms like this, invisible choices often carried the most weight. Sit too quickly and you looked grateful. Remain standing too long and you looked theatrical. She sat like someone who belonged there, because now she did. The board counsel on screen adjusted his glasses. For the record, I'd like confirmation of 3 things. First, that transaction continuity has been preserved. Second, that authority at the time of execution was valid. Third, that any attempted interruption occurred during an active and material closing window. Elena answered before anyone else could. Her voice was steady, low, exact. Yes to all 3. Support? She slid her tablet forward, then nodded toward Dana's binder. Executed counterparty acknowledgement. Treasury trigger completion. Emergency addendum at 6:03 a.m. and internal routing logs tied to the interference request. The counsel looked to Dana. Verified, Dana said. Then to Adrian. Confirmed, he added. 3 words, 2 witnesses, 1 structure. That was the second verdict. On the board screen, one of the independent directors leaned forward. Why was Elena's authority vulnerable to internal challenge at all? A fair question, a dangerous one, the kind that didn't ask who was wrong, the kind that asked how the building had allowed the wrong person to reach the switch. Adrian clasped his hands. Because our transition controls assumed good faith higher up the chain? Miriam's gaze sharpened, and this morning established that assumption as unreliable. No one disputed it. The sentence dropped into the room like a seal pressed into hot wax. Elena watched the light move across the walnut table, across the untouched water glasses, across the abandoned termination packet. A strange calm had settled over her now, not victory, not relief, something more precise, recognition, because this was no longer about surviving humiliation. It was about what happened when competence remained standing after ego had been escorted out. The investor relations lead cleared her throat. The market implication matters too. If the deal had slipped past the pricing corridor, we would be answering for that by lunch. 8 figures, Adrian said. Potentially more, Elena added. Once counterparties smell instability, they don't price the same risk twice. They price the fear behind it. That made one director nod slowly. Finally, someone on the board asked the question the whole morning had been circling without touching. Who preserved the deal? No one rushed to answer, because some truths, once spoken aloud, alter reporting lines. Adrian looked at the screen, then at Elena. Elena did. There it was, no embellishment, no speech, no ceremonial tone, just fact. But facts sound different when spoken by a CFO in front of a board after a $90 million execution window has already closed in your favor. They sound permanent. The room absorbed it. Miriam folded one hand over the other. And who attempted to remove her before completion? This time, Adrian didn't answer immediately, not out of hesitation, out of discipline. He knew, as everyone in the room knew, that once the name was spoken on the record, the story would stop being office politics and become governance history. Dana saved him the delay. Martin Kessler, she said. The board counsel wrote something down. No one asked her to repeat it. That was the third verdict. Outside the room, a phone rang somewhere down the corridor, then stopped. The ordinary sounds of the building felt almost indecent now, like laughter outside an operating theater. Miriam turned her attention back to Elena. One more question. When he entered with the packet, she glanced briefly toward the black folder still lying on the table. Did you already know the deal would hold? Elena looked at the city beyond the glass before answering. The light on the towers had gone harder now, brighter, stripping everything decorative off the skyline and leaving only edges. It suited the morning. Yes, she said. Why? A lesser person might have used the moment, might have sharpened the line, dressed it in wit, let the room admire the wound. Elena didn't. Because power that survives humiliation learns quickly not to perform for applause. I knew the deal would hold, she said, because I wasn't protecting my title. A pause. Then, with the same calm, I was protecting the company from the man carrying the paperwork. That sentence did what shouting never could. It ended debate. The board counsel stopped writing for half a second. Investor relations lowered her eyes. Even Adrian went still. Miriam looked at Elena for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, not softened exactly, but narrowed into something cleaner. Effective immediately, she said, all authority tied to the executed transaction, counterparty stabilization, and any post-close communications remains with Elena Morozova until further board notice. No one interrupted. Additionally, Miriam continued, any review of the governance incident will proceed outside Martin Kessler's supervision, access, or influence. There are moments when power arrives loudly. This was not one of them. This power arrived like a lock turning, quiet, internal, absolute. Dana made a note. Adrian gave one short nod. Compliance wrote faster. The council on screen requested document circulation by 11:30. One director asked for access logs, another requested a written chronology before noon. The machine had begun. And once that machine started, it did not care who once walked the corridor with a smirk. Elena sat back, hands lightly folded, while the board shifted from shock to mechanism. That was another thing powerful rooms did well. They metabolized scandal quickly once they understood who had value and who had risk. The difference now was that Elena was no longer sitting on the risk side of the table. The termination packet still lay there, dark and useless. She reached for it before anyone else could. Not abruptly, not dramatically. She drew it toward her, opened it, glanced once at the signature tabs, the HR watermark, the confident formatting of a decision made too early. Then she closed it again and passed it to Dana. "For the record," Elena said. Dana took it, no smile, no flourish, just custody. That was the fourth verdict. The board session began to close. Miriam gave her final directives in concise, sharpened phrases. Adrian was to maintain continuity. Dana was to preserve the chain. Council would oversee review. Elena would lead post-close stabilization and report directly until further notice. It was all very clean. That was the cruelty of it. Martin had tried to reduce her to paper. Instead, paper had removed him from the room. The screen went dark one window at a time until only the board seal remained. Then that too disappeared. The room fell into a reflective hush, thick with processed consequence. For the first time all morning, no one had anything left to prove. Adrian looked at Elena across the table, not as a rival, not as a subordinate, not as a problem to be managed before the next calendar invite, as the person who had walked into an ambush carrying a closing strategy and left the company intact. "You should have been briefed sooner," he said. It was not an apology. Men at his altitude rarely offered those incomplete sentences, but it was near enough to one to matter. Elena gathered her tablet. "I was busy." A faint breath of humor moved through Dana's nose. Not quite laughter. Too elegant for that. Just acknowledgement. Adrian glanced toward the closed door. "He thought he was ending your authority." Elena rose, smoothing the front of her jacket. The morning had finally caught up to her body. The long hours, the midnight calls, the sharpened focus, but none of it reached her face. "No," she said. "He thought authority was something he could carry into a room." She slid the tablet under her arm. "Turns out," she added, "it was already here." And that was the line the room kept. Not because it was clever, because it was true. Dana gathered the packet, the binder, the access chronology. Adrian stood in silence by the window, looking out over a city that had no idea how close it had come to watching $90 million slip because one man mistook arrogance for command. Elena walked to the door and opened it. The corridor beyond was bright, polished, deceptively normal. A few people looked up, then away, then back again, slower this time. News traveled fast in glass buildings, but posture traveled faster. She stepped out carrying no visible trophy, no raised chin, no theatrical calm. Just the unmistakable stillness of someone who had entered the morning as a target and left it as the authority. Silence.